Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. Is America blind to the battles that matter? And is the U.S. losing influence to nations like China and Russia? Let's get to the bottom line. The United States has been king of the hill in the world for decades, managing what is essentially a global empire that's either feared or loved anywhere you go, and generating massive wealth and power for American citizens. But now some of the country's leading thinkers are wondering out loud if America's kicking down its own hill. Is America's global influence simply fading? Today we're talking to someone who's been thinking about America's challenges from a military and strategic point of view for a very long time. He pulls no punches and he wears no rose-colored glasses. HR McMaster is a retired U.S. Army Lieutenant General and former National Security Advisor to President Trump. And he's just published a new book, Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World, which talks about the threats facing American prosperity and influence around the globe. General McMaster, great to be with you. As you look at America's weaknesses and vulnerabilities today, given that experience, how do you see things?
Well, Stephen, thank you for the opportunity to be with you and to be here with your listeners. And I really think it was the beginning of a new era of warfare. There were a lot of continuity still in the nature of war. War's still political and human and uncertain and a contest of wills. But really what this new era opened up were tremendous opportunities to use emerging technologies to accomplish objectives not only in war, but to accomplish objectives in forms of competition short of war. And that's what we've seen Russia in particular perfect over the decade of the 2000s.
You know, when I look at your main points of argument, you argue that America is a strategically narcissistic nation. It has strategically narcissistic generals and politicians and advisors. And what you mean by that is they look at the world through the American prism itself and alone, and not looking at the ambitions and passions of other players out there in the world. When you were in the White House, were you able to shift that narcissism into what you call empathy, or trying to understand some of the other problems and challenges America has?
Stephen, I believe we did. I was there for 13 months, and during that 13 months, I brought with me some lessons of history. I'd written a book on how and why Vietnam became an American war. And in that book, I identified certain pitfalls in national security decision-making in Lyndon Johnson's administration between November 1963, when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and July 1965, when large numbers of U.S. troops deployed to Vietnam. One of those pitfalls was a rush to action without fully understanding the nature of the challenges associated with ensuring the freedom and independence of South Vietnam. And so what I was determined to do is to put into place a process that would allow the departments and agencies, the president's cabinet, to convene around framing challenges to national security and international security, understanding them on their own terms, viewing them through the lens of our vital interests, and then crafting overarching goals and more specific objectives. In particular, too, Stephen, I thought it was immensely important to examine the often implicit assumptions that underpin foreign policy and to subject those assumptions to scrutiny. And this is where I think we were able to apply a corrective to strategic narcissism, which I define really as viewing the world mainly in relation to us, and then assuming that we will be decisive to the outcome. It underappreciates, strategic narcissism does, the agency, the influence, the authorship over the future that others have. And so recognizing this continuous interactive nature of strategy and policy, I thought was immensely important.
You know, one of the things that comes, blaring through the book is the importance of key allies. I mean, your chapter on South Korea and Japan was very, very powerful. But in an era that many people are going to define as, this inflection point is America first, does an America first framing fit with the kind of scaffolding you're trying to bring to foreign policy?
Well, Stephen, I think it's a demonstrable fact that America has been a force for good in the world, right? If you go back to the bloodiest war in modern history, bloodiest century in modern history, the 20th century, it was the United States who entered late into World War I, but actually helped complete the defeat of Germany and restore peace, at least for a time, to the European continent. And then, of course, it was in World War II where the United States, along with its allies, defeated Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. But then I think very importantly, Stephen, and I know that you're a student of this, has established an international order that lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and has prevented great power conflict, at least for the last 75 years. But I think what's very important for us to recognize is that all of this is contested. We are in a continuous competition, and it's really not the U.S. and China or the U.S. and Russia. What I think we're seeing today, Stephen, and what I write about in the book, is the free world is up against these authoritarian and closed systems that are actively promoting those systems as an alternative to democratic governance, in which people actually have a say in how they're governed, and in our free market economic systems, which free people up who have entrepreneurial spirit to help build better lives for them and generations to come.
Well, General, a lot of people have framed, along the lines, you have, that America was this bastion of liberal values, democracy, commitment to minority rights, commitment to justice. And a lot of folks are looking at us from abroad and saying, wow, America may not look, may look a little wobbly on those fronts. The president and his comments about, leaving office, perhaps, not peacefully if he were to lose the election, or, concerns about, voting and whatnot. And I'm just wondering, we don't look like that shining example on the Hill in the eyes of many in the world. Are you able to square that?
I am. So America, from its founding on, was never perfect. And I think what's remarkable about America is our ability for self-improvement that comes from introspection, that comes from self-criticism. Our citizens have a right to voice their dissent. Our citizens have a right to decide who governs them. That is what's most powerful, is that the radical idea of the American Revolution was that sovereignty lies with the American people. Now, of course, we had tremendous contradictions in our founding, in our Constitution. Foremost among them was the institution of slavery. And it took almost 100 years before we ended that institution in our most destructive war in history, emancipating 4 million people. Now, of course, that was imperfect in and of itself, because the Reconstruction period after the Civil War failed, you had the growth of what we call in the United States, Jim Crow, which is really a legal form of disadvantaging Black Americans, which was not really fully dismantled until the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And hey, it's still a work in progress, right? But it's a work in progress, and I'm someone who has great faith in this American experiment in democracy. And I think even as we see what people internationally, they view probably as our weaknesses, right? This dissent, I see it as a strength. And Stephen, I have that one chapter in the book of turning weaknesses into strengths, because I think there are authoritarian regimes like the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, they probably see protests and think, God, we could never have that, right? So Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party, they're racing, right? They're racing to expand their population control through this technology-enabled surveillance police state, right? So I think when you look at China, when you look at other authoritarian regimes, it makes you thankful for what we have, even in the ugliness, right? The ugliness of this vitriolic discourse we're seeing in this political season. I think we have a lot to celebrate as Americans, and sometimes we miss it, right? We miss it because we are naturally self-critical, which is a strength. But I think it's possible to do two things. I think it's possible. It's possible for us to lament the murder of George Floyd, the police brutality aimed at minorities, inequality of opportunity, and still have pride that we have the mechanisms in place in our separation of powers, in the responsiveness that our governments have to the people to get better and to work on equality of opportunity, and to do that really across the political spectrum, which is one of the purposes of the book, Stephen. I really worry that we're becoming so polarized, right? That is dysfunctional, right? We need to come together and have discussions.
No, I mean, you end the book. I got to the last page. You end the book on we need to educate people. We need to bring them back together. We need to create civics and bring people and understand that they are despite our differences, they are at the same time together. It's a very powerful ending to that. But you also make no bones about the fact that Russia is actively inside this country, trying to divide, trying to maximize that. I mean, it's one of the most robust articulations of Russian malfeasance in the United States that I have read. And I'm wondering where you're going with that, because we don't always hear your former boss, President Trump, articulating those same kinds of concerns. And you work, day every day, right with him.
And Stephen, that's just wrong, right? When the president says, that, Putin's my friend, or doesn't want to acknowledge this campaign of disruption and denial, he gives Putin space to deny even his most egregious acts, right? This is a person who likely has directed the poisoning with a nerve agent of his greatest political rival just recently, Mr. Navalny. He did the same thing against Sergei Skripal and his daughter, endangering potentially thousands of people in the UK, and then he just denies it. I mean, this is also, shooting down an airliner over Ukraine with incontrovertible evidence, and he denies it. And of course, we expect the same denial from him, and he does repeatedly about attacking not only our elections, but attacking the fabric of our society. I think what was important about that chapter on Putin's playbook, right, is that really I don't think the Kremlin cares who wins our elections as long as we doubt the result, right, and as long as we doubt our democratic processes and institutions. And so we have to guard against that, and we can't be our own worst enemy. When the president says, "Oh, well, I don't think this is happening," he's being our own worst enemy. And so I think let's not make it easy for Vladimir Putin. Let's confront this challenge head on in two ways, right? One is to expose it and to impose costs on the Kremlin for this behavior. But the other is, a lot of this is in our power, right? We can come together as a society and make ourselves less vulnerable as well.
General, I was in Beijing many years ago. It was during the time of Hu Jintao, and I was meeting with the equivalent of the policy planning director at their version of the State Department, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So I asked him, I said, I've never been in this place again like this before. What's your grand strategy? And he says, our grand strategy is to try to figure out how to keep America engaged and distracted by small Middle Eastern countries. And they were joking, but there was an element of seriousness, a lack of strategic clarity. You go through the world, the Middle East, China, Russia, Afghanistan, an endless war there, North Korea. And I guess my question to you is, while we're engaged with all of these other distractions, is China winning?
Well, I think China thinks it's winning, which is important to point out right now, I think. I think China has some really significant vulnerabilities, and the Chinese Communist Party does as well. And what they're driven by, Stephen, is this combination of this grand ambition that you're alluding to take center stage, this agenda of national rejuvenation, but they're also driven by fear of losing their exclusive grip on power. This is why they're engaged in a campaign of cultural genocide in Xinjiang. This is abhorrent. I think everyone across the world needs to be much, much more vocal about putting 1 million people in concentration camps, extending this surveillance police state in a way that stifles human freedom, destroying, in this recent report, 8,500 mosques, right, damaging maybe 7,500 additional mosques. And, Stephen, the Uyghur birth rate is down 60%, right, due to forced sterilizations. Forced abortions, implants of IUDs. This is horrible, right? And I just can't understand why more of the world, right? Well, more of the Muslim world, the Islamic world, isn't just up in arms about this. But what this is fear that is what the party's motivated by, and there are some real vulnerabilities. I think China sees what it had always seen as a fleeting window of opportunity to realize the China dream. They see it maybe closing more rapidly, but at the same time, as we're enmeshed in the COVID crisis in particular, Stephen, I think Xi Jinping's in an echo chamber of sorts, right? I mean, I think if you're a dictator, you tend to surround yourself with people who tell you, "Oh, great idea. I wish I had thought of that." And I think Xi Jinping is hearing, "Hey, you're winning. You're on top." look at how screwed up America is. Look at the racial divisions. Look at the vitriolic nature of their presidential campaign. Look at the doubts they have about themselves, right? And so I think it's a very dangerous time, Stephen, because of that. I think what's even more important than whether or not they're winning is I think maybe they perceive they are winning, and they also are desperate to capitalize on what they view as a narrow window of opportunity.
You know, I also want to just talk to you about national security decision making. The National Security Advisor role is such an important role. You know, we've talked about General Brent Scowcroft and others before. In the late 90s, I was involved with a project that was looking at how do you reform the Goldwater-Nichols Act and this is not to bore our viewers, but this is a restructuring of those key principles who were involved in national security decision making. And it was done after Franklin Roosevelt was president because there was a fear that there might in the future be a very strong president who did not really respect or follow the contours of smart national security decision making. My question to you is, how do you feel that structure of decision making is today? Is it strong and solid, or do you worry that it is not playing the role that it should be?
Stephen, I worry that it's not playing the role that it should be, but maybe not as much for structural reasons as the way the instrument is used, right? So as you alluded to, it was after World War II and confronting the Cold War competition with the Soviet Union that the National Security Act of 1948 establishes the National Security Council. And the idea was also in their minds was, hey, let's prevent another Pearl Harbor, right? We have to make sure that we integrate efforts across departments and agencies. We share information and analysis, give the president options, plural, to cope with these challenges to our security and to our prosperity as well. So the National Security Council staff has been used in different ways by different presidents over time. And it's a really interesting history. It's a history that I learned and taught based on my earlier book on Vietnam and teaching history at West Point. And so I really felt like it was a gift for me to bring that historical knowledge into the West Wing of the White House. And then, of course, it dawns on you, hey, well, I'm the person responsible for this now. I wrote about how people have screwed it up in the past, and now it's on me to make it work. So I think it's all about how the president uses it. What's interesting now is there is this sort of undercurrent certainly within the Trump administration. It's been existent in previous administrations, Ronald Reagan, I think, foremost among them, in which presidents come in kind of running against the government. And then once they're there, especially I think for the Trump administration, they in some ways go to war against their own government. And in this case, I think, saw this kind of idea of a deep state, a resistance to shifts in policy. And that ire and that concern, I think, was directed at the National Security Council staff, when in fact, it's the National Security Council staff that actually helps the president more than any other organization to understand what options exist across those departments and agencies, and then implement his decisions and his policies. So I think it's how it's used. I think in the 13 months that I was there, we presented options. We put into place, Stephen, I think and I write about this in Battlegrounds, some very significant shifts to our policy, some of which have been sadly reversed, I think. But I think the way it functions, and I wrote about this in Dereliction of Duty, the book I wrote on Vietnam, it relies mainly on personalities and relationships, I think, even more than organizational structure.
Let me ask you about Iran for a minute. And you and I don't share exactly the same worldview on Iran. I saw more benefit to the JCPOA than you certainly did. But you make a really interesting point. You said that that the duplicity, the different tugs that are involved inside Iran's national character are ones that are not going to go away overnight. Right. And I guess my question to you is, as you're dealing with adversaries, when we dealt with the Soviet Union as an adversary, but we still did deals with them, I'm just wondering, because your book doesn't give us a playbook of how you deal with thugs that are in the world, despite what you see as really serious flawed motivations and character that you're not going to change through, one negotiation.
Right. Well, Stephen, I think the first step is to reject strategic narcissism in the form of creating the adversary you want, rather than the adversary that actually exists. And what I argue in your Iran chapters is that we did that with Iran, right? We've always fallen for the trick of Iran putting forward kind of the shop window, right? The public face of the regime, while the regime really is still very much captured by the ideology of the revolution, and the desire to export that ideology as what it sees as the main way for it to extend its influence across the Middle East. I mean, the Iranian regime wants to keep the Arab world perpetually weak and enmeshed in conflict so it can establish that hegemonic influence, drive the great Satan, the United States, out of the region, and threaten the little Satan, Israel, with destruction, as well as the Arab monarchies, with destruction. And so I think it's important for us to recognize this is what's driving them, as well as this now corrupt order, really a criminalized patronage network that's established that puts these bunyads, the children most often of the most senior clerics, in charge of these business conglomerates. So what they want to do is continue to profit from this exclusive grip on power that the supreme leader, the Guardian Council have over the regime, as well as the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, the keepers of the revolution. But every time a new president comes in who seems that he might be conciliatory, this is hot to me, remember in the late 90s, well, he's a librarian, he must be very nice, or we have, Rouhani was the next great hope. And now we have Mr. Zarif, who goes around the world speaking the Queen's English, acting very conciliatory, while the regime continues its 4-decade-long proxy war against the United States, the Arab monarchies, and Israel. And so what I argue is, when you look at your adversary, look at what they're doing more than what they're saying, and try to understand better the emotions and the ideology that drive and constrain them. And when you do that with Iran, you realize that you have to compete with Iran. A conciliatory approach is not going to work with the regime.
General, President Trump recently referred to generals out there and soldiers. Let's hear the clip.
I'm not saying the military is in love with me. The soldiers are. The top people in the Pentagon probably aren't, because they want to do nothing but fight wars so that all of those wonderful companies that make the bombs and make the planes and make everything else stay happy. But we're getting out of the endless wars. You know how we're doing.
So, General, are you and your colleagues in the defense establishment really just committed to ongoing wars, as the president says?
No, not at all. I mean, the last people who want to fight in war are those who are actually doing the fighting, who see the tremendous costs of war, who see the human cost of war. I would say that the wars that we have been fighting, Stephen, across the greater Middle East, from South Asia to the Fertile Crescent in Iraq and Syria, I would characterize them as humanitarian interventions. I mean, we're at war with the enemies of all civilized people. These takfirin, these Salafi jihadists, they are murderers and criminals who try to cloak their criminal and murderous agenda in a cloak of a perverted interpretation of religion, right? And of course, it's very important for us to remember the greatest victims of these terrorist organizations are fellow Muslims, right? And so I see these as interventions on behalf of the Muslim world and behalf of all really humanity. I think we're engaged in many ways on a modern day frontier between civilization and barbarism, right? These are people who are determined to stifle human freedom and have visited the most horrible, heinous acts on humanity. So we're not fighting because we like to fight wars. I mean, I think we're fighting on behalf of humanity in these conflicts. And by the way, we're fighting alongside amazing partners, right? In Afghanistan, for example, this year, we lost 10 of our courageous soldiers in combat there. But we should remember that in Afghanistan, about 30 Afghan soldiers and police die every day fighting to defend the freedoms they've enjoyed since that country threw off the yoke of the Taliban in 2001, right? So I think that we have tremendous partners, and of course, I have so many friends now across the Middle East and Afghanistan. I care deeply about them and their families, and that's why we're engaged in these wars.
Well, General HR McMaster, former National Security Advisor of the President of the United States, congratulations on the book Battlegrounds. I have worked through every page of my own here, folks. Enjoy yours, and I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts on where this country is going and what its strategic deficits are. Thank you so much.
Stephen, thank you for the opportunity to be with you.
So what's the bottom line? My guest is a decorated general, and he's fought America's wars abroad. General McMaster believes that Americans need to unite domestically and be more engaged globally. He believes America needs to become less narcissistic and more empathetic towards both enemies and allies, and understand what's driving them. That's the opposite, in my view, of America First. That's how to re-anchor a foreign policy that will have traction and make America a more effective, more dependable, and more responsible global stakeholder. And that's the bottom line.